In 1960, outside St. Louis, Missouri, a construction crew was doing what construction crews do: grading land, moving earth, making way for a new highway that would carry a growing American city forward into the future. The work was routine, the equipment was loud, the schedule was tight. Then something stopped them. Not rock, not pipe, not the usual subsurface debris that slows a project. What the equipment hit was earth, but earth that had been placed there deliberately, compacted in layers, engineered with a precision that had no business existing beneath a 1960s highway project outside a Midwestern American city. A local archaeologist named Warren Wittry was called to the site. He assumed it was minor, a small mound, perhaps. Something catalogued, documented, and ultimately paved over the way 1,000 other inconvenient historical remnants had been handled across the expanding American landscape. He would assess it, file a report, and move on. He did not move on, because what Wittry found beneath the construction zone was not small. It was not minor. And it was not alone. Before we go further, pause for a moment and ask yourself something honest. Have you ever heard of Cahokia? And if a city larger than medieval London once existed on American soil, built and abandoned centuries before any European set foot on this continent, do you believe that kind of story disappears from history by accident? The structure that stopped Warren Wittry's assumptions in their tracks is called Monk's Mound, and the first thing you need to understand about it is the scale, because the scale is where this investigation begins to feel wrong. Monk's Mound covers 14 acres at its base. It rises 100 feet into the Illinois sky. In total volume, it contains more earth than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was not formed by geological accident. Every cubic foot of it was carried, placed, and compacted by human hands. Hundreds of millions of cubic feet of earth, moved without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals. The engineering required to achieve that result, at that scale, with those constraints, is not what American history taught most of us to expect from pre-Columbian North America. And Monk's Mound is not a geological curiosity sitting quietly in undisturbed wilderness. It sits surrounded by suburbs, by strip malls, by the infrastructure of a modern American metropolitan area that expanded around it and through it across the 20th century, seemingly without ever pausing to ask what it was building on top of. Who built this? When? And why, if the answer to those questions was documented, has it remained so far outside the common understanding of American history? The answer begins around 1050 AD, and it forces a complete reconsideration of what was happening on this continent 1,000 years ago. At its peak, the city that archaeologists call Cahokia was home to an estimated 20,000 people. That number needs a moment to land. 20,000 people in 1100 AD, in what is now southwestern Illinois, at a time when London, the capital of a medieval European kingdom, held roughly the same population. Cahokia was not a village. It was not a seasonal camp. It was not a loose collection of settlements that later historians chose to call a city for dramatic effect. It was a city, planned, organized, populated at a scale that places it among the significant urban centers of the medieval world. It had a central grand plaza covering 50 acres, a deliberately cleared and leveled public space larger than 30 football fields. It had residential districts arranged in recognizable patterns. It had a hierarchical structure visible in the archaeological record, with elite residences, elevated on constructed platforms, and common housing clustered in organized neighborhoods below. And at the edge of the plaza, it had something that nobody building a simple agricultural settlement builds. It had a solar observatory. But before that, before the astronomy, before the trade networks, before the darkest discoveries this investigation would eventually reach, there is a question that sits underneath everything else, a question that becomes harder to ignore the longer you look at the evidence. Who exactly were the people who built all of this? Archaeologists call them the Mississippian culture. It is a name that describes where they lived, not who they were. It is a geographical placeholder, the scholarly equivalent of naming a civilization after the river it lived near, and leaving every other question unanswered. And every other question is unanswered. There is no confirmed name for these people in any language. There is no confirmed oral tradition that directly and documentably links any surviving indigenous nation to Cahokia's construction and occupation. There are no written records, which is expected for this period, but the absence of any confirmed cultural continuity is something else. A city of 20,000 people existed for 3 centuries. People were born there, lived there, built there, buried their dead there, and eventually left. And the identity of those people, who they called themselves, what language they spoke, which nations today carry their direct cultural inheritance, remains officially unconfirmed. Sit with that for a moment. Because in the investigation that Wittry's highway discovery eventually opened, that absence would come to feel less like a historical gap and more like a historical wound. What is confirmed is this: whoever they were watching the sky with a sophistication that the standard narrative of pre-Columbian North America has never fully accommodated. Cahokia's Woodhenge, named by analogy to the more famous structure in Wiltshire, England, was a series of large red cedar posts arranged in precise circles across the site. Excavations beginning in the 1960s revealed not one Woodhenge but several, constructed and reconstructed over generations, each one maintaining a critical alignment. On the morning of the spring equinox, an observer standing at the center of the circle and looking east would watch the sun rise directly over Monk's Mound. The same precision held at the fall equinox. The summer and winter solstices were marked with equal exactitude. This is not approximation. This is not coincidence. Achieving this level of solar alignment requires sustained astronomical observation across years or decades, precise geometric calculation, and the organizational capacity to translate those calculations into physical construction at a scale that preserved their accuracy. It requires, in short, a knowledge system, a tradition, people who understood what they were doing and why. Provision solar monuments appear across the ancient world, in Britain, in Egypt, in Mesoamerica, in the Andes. When they appear, historians treat them as evidence of sophisticated civilization. When one appears in Illinois, the conversation has historically been more complicated, but Cahokia's sophistication did not stop at the sky. It extended in every direction across the continent. The artifacts recovered from Cahokia's excavations do not come from Illinois. They come from everywhere. Copper, worked into ceremonial objects of considerable artistry, sourced from the Great Lakes region, hundreds of miles north. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, transported more than 500 miles. Mica from the Appalachian Mountains, carried across the eastern third of the continent. Flint, obsidian, and raw materials from sources spanning the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast. These objects did not travel by accident. They traveled through a trade network, organized, sustained, and operating at a continental scale that places Cahokia not at the edge of civilization, but at its center. Cahokia was not receiving these goods passively. The quantity, variety, and geographic spread of the materials suggest a hub, a place of sufficient political authority, cultural magnetism, or economic power to draw resources from every direction across a continent. What kind of authority produces that kind of reach? And what kind of authority produces what excavators found in Mound 72? Mound 72 is a small ridge mound sitting south of Monk's Mound. Its excavation, conducted in the early 1960s, and documented in published archaeological reports that have been available for decades, uncovered something that permanently altered the understanding of how Cahokia's power actually functioned. At the center of Mound 72 lay the burial of a high-status individual, a man placed on a platform of more than 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird. Around him, in pits that were clearly prepared and filled deliberately, lay the remains of more than 250 people. The majority were young women. The skeletal evidence indicates that many were killed specifically for the burial, not victims of disease or war interred nearby, but individuals sacrificed as part of a mortuary ritual centered on the individual at the core. This is not ambiguous. The archaeological reports do not soften the finding. The pattern, a high-status central burial surrounded by sacrificial victims, matches ritual structures documented in ancient civilizations across the world, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. It is evidence of a religious and political hierarchy so absolute that human life was an acceptable currency for expressing it. It was published. It was documented. It exists in institutional records that any researcher can access, and it is almost entirely absent from how Cahokia is discussed in public education. That absence connects to the next question, and the next question is where this investigation moves from archaeology into something that feels more deliberate. Because by 1350 AD, Cahokia was gone. Not conquered, not buried by disaster, not slowly replaced by another settlement, simply abandoned, the population dispersed, the city emptied, and the civilization that had sustained continental trade networks, built solar observatories, and organized mass ritual sacrifice across 3 centuries of occupation left behind no agreed explanation for why it ended. Drought has been proposed. The climate record shows a period of reduced rainfall in the region during the relevant time frame, but the timeline doesn't align cleanly with the abandonment. Disease has been proposed, but there is no epidemic signature in the skeletal record sufficient to explain a city-scale collapse. Internal political fragmentation has been proposed. Warfare, resource depletion, each theory accounts for some of the evidence, none accounts for all of it. The collapse of Cahokia remains, in the formal academic literature, an open question without consensus. Every major ancient civilization that collapsed has a primary accepted explanation. Rome fell to a combination of internal decay and external pressure. The Bronze Age collapse left identifiable destruction layers. The Maya decline shows clear environmental signatures. Cahokia, a city that existed for 300 years at a scale comparable to any of these, has no agreed cause of death. Why? That question opened the final layer of this investigation, and it led not back to the ancient past, but directly into the 19th century, and into a deliberate institutional choice about what American history was allowed to contain. The mounds were always visible. European settlers encountered them immediately upon arriving in the Mississippi Valley. They were impossible to miss, hundreds of them scattered across the landscape, clearly constructed, clearly deliberate, clearly the product of organized human effort. The question of who built them was immediate and unavoidable. The answer that 19th century American archaeology chose to promote was not indigenous people. It was a lost race, a vanished white civilization, predating the indigenous nations who had built the mounds and then been destroyed or displaced. This theory, known as the mound builder myth, was not a fringe position. It was published in respected journals, promoted by institutional archaeologists, endorsed by the Smithsonian Institution, and incorporated into public understanding of American prehistory. It served a clear cultural function. If the mounds were built by a lost white race rather than by indigenous people, then the moral calculus of displacing indigenous nations from that land became considerably simpler. The mound builder myth was definitively debunked by the end of the 19th century. The evidence was clear and conclusive. Indigenous people built the mounds. The scientific consensus was established, and Cahokia still never entered the mainstream of American historical education. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. It predates most of the European medieval cities that American students study in standard curricula. And the majority of Americans, including many who live within driving distance of the site, cannot name it. The mound builder myth was wrong, but the institutional habit of minimizing what Cahokia represented outlasted the myth itself. The debunking happened. The correction never fully followed, which brings us to where this investigation ends, which is not a resolution, because there is no resolution available. The mounds are still there. Monk's Mound still rises 100 feet above the Illinois plain, surrounded by suburban sprawl, that built itself around and through a World Heritage Site without appearing to notice. The artifacts are still in museum storage rooms, catalogued and available. Copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf, mica from the Appalachians, all of it evidence of a continental network that American history has never fully absorbed. The Mound 72 excavation reports are still in the archives. The astronomical alignments are still visible if you stand in the right place at the right time of year and look east toward the sunrise. Everything needed to understand Cahokia exists. It has existed for decades. The evidence did not disappear. The documentation did not burn. The research was conducted and published and filed, and the story was still not told. That is the question this investigation cannot answer, not what Cahokia was. The evidence for that is substantial, even if incomplete. Not who built it. The Mississippian attribution is documented. even if the identity underneath that geographical label remains officially unconfirmed, not even fully why it collapsed. The theories exist, even if none of them closes the case. The question that remains is simpler and more unsettling than any of those. If one civilization, 20,000 people, 3 centuries of occupation, continental trade networks, solar observatories, mass ritual burial, and a mound larger than the Great Pyramid, could be this thoroughly removed from the common understanding of American history, through myth, through institutional neglect, through a century of educational omission, that continued long after the myths were debunked. What does that removal tell us about everything else we think we know? The mound is still there, standing in the Illinois plain, waiting, as it has been waiting for 700 years, for someone to finally ask the right question.